And good evening wherever you are watching us from. On behalf of the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement and the Water Policy Center, it gives me great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, chair and participants who have joined us with the session. To chair this session, we have Professor Yoshiro Sato with us today. It's my great pleasure to introduce the chair. Professor Yoshiro Sato is a professor with the Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University, Japan. He is an experienced professor with a demonstrated history of working in the higher education industry as well as in the government. He is presently focused on producing the next generation of both academic, policy, and opinion leaders. He is a strong education professional with a doctorate of philosophy in political science and is skilled in international relations and foreign policy. Without extending further, let me request Professor Sato to take charge of the session. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm very sorry my technical error has delayed some of the session. But without further ado, I'd like to move into chairing this session. We have 4 speakers for this panel, and each speaker will have 15 minutes of presentation. And because of the time constraints, I will have to be very strict about this. I'll give you a warning at 12-minute mark, and then you will have 3 minutes to conclude and wrap up your discussion. The first speaker is Dr. Koel Basu, Assistant Professor of Jangpur College, and her presentation is Media in Times of COVID-19 Responsibilities and Relevance. So please, Dr. Basu, proceed to your presentation.
Am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So I have sent the PPT. I want it to be shared. Okay, before that I begin my presentation. Yes, it is viewable. A very good afternoon to everyone across all time zones. I take this opportunity to thank YPC, its director, organizing committee of NICE, Dr. Pramod, to give me this wonderful opportunity on this August platform to present my whatever I want to say, my speech. Here, this is something which is different from whatever I've been hearing, and I hope I'll be able to make a point to you. Thank you, Chair, for giving me this opportunity. My today's topic is media in the times of COVID-19, responsibilities and relevance. Now, we know that COVID-19 is definitely an extraordinary event, as it is famously called the Black Swan event of the century. We haven't faced anything before quite in 100 years. So here a lot of factors are working together, and one of them is definitely media, which is coming up with its own news presentations, and much of it is diluting the event. So we'll get into that. My presentation will focus basically on new media, distinctly different from traditional media, which is taking a very important and pertinent role in this pandemic. And I'll definitely focus on the positive and the negative effects of the media. So this is the broad framework or outline of my presentation. So to start with, I'll refer to a very important article that has been written in July, which just came up in scroll.in by Sanjay Subramaniam, where he is talking about the pandemic, whether it will be a turn in history. Will the pandemic be a turn in the history of the world? Now, definitely it will be a turn, as we here are discussing about post-pandemic world, but I want to make my submission that before discussing about post-pandemic world order, we are still in the pandemic. We are navigating the pandemic. So I think it's very early to talk about a post-pandemic world order, and we should directly come to the present circumstances, what's going on. Next slide, please. We are talking when we are talking about the new media, we are talking about websites, blogs, social media, which is playing a very important role. And since we know that media is the interface between government, grassroots communities, policymakers, new media is increasingly playing a very important role as traditional media has taken a back seat. And here I have given some figures regarding the users of new media as Facebook, followed by YouTube in India, as statistics says. And then there are WhatsApp users. There is a important term used by Lancet, WhatsAppitis. We are so much used to new media in our daily lives, WhatsApp, Facebook, everything, that we are hooked to it. So new media is increasingly playing a very important role in our lives and to putting up stories about the pandemic. I think the slides are not moving, are they? Can you see my slides? Hello? Yeah. Media's role and COVID-19. I think first I'll focus on the positive sides of what media is doing. Media is playing a very positive role throughout the world, and it is raising public awareness about the disease outbreak. It is educating people regarding by coming up with posts on hand washing and various measures that we should take in order to keep the disease at bay. Social media like Facebook has launched a dedicated COVID-19 information center. It has also given funds to WHO, and it is asking us to how to cope up with staying at home. Staying at home because home is the new quarantine sanctuary. Twitter is also focusing on providing country-specific information on the pandemic. Instagram is also coming up with posts on it. Likey, LinkedIn, they are also there. Next is important is content. I'll talk about briefly about the content. Here I'm saying that content is the king, because whatever we present, whatever the media presents, and I have taken a quote from the famous novelist Ben Oakley, where he's talking about not only self-isolation, and there are certain errors, please forgive me in the slides, self-isolation and science that save us. It is also laughter, catharsis, and the optimism of being able to see beyond the times. This is very important. Media should play a role in helping us to see beyond our times with stories, with songs, and that's why media is extremely, content should be standard and ethical. Otherwise, there are two emotions which will grip us, that is fear and anger. And there is a lot of anger against the media because of its inauthenticity. So content should be very important, and the social media hysteria should be combated. As we know that Facebook CEO has admitted that he's trying to, develop ethics on Facebook. There has been a lot of controversy regarding Facebook recently in news about BJP and Facebook nexus. They are not focusing on hate speeches, all those things. And so therefore content is a very important factor. It should be balanced, informative, and unbiased. And if we talk about the next part, that is about misinformation and disinformation, how media is playing a very negative role, especially social media. Social media is being charged with a lot of lots of allegation that it is spreading misinformation. And famously, the Director General of WHO has been talking about this misinformation, and it is called misinfodemics. Misinfodemics is spreading of misinformation which is contagious, just like the virus. And it is like spreading of fake news without any malicious intent. And now there is a fine line of difference between misinformation and disinformation. When we are talking about misinformation, we are talking about spreading of fake news, and disinformation is not misinformation. It is about intentionally talking about fake news with malicious content. So misinformation is also extremely something which has to be avoided, which is extremely bad for people, because they have unnecessary expectations regarding diagnosis, medication, and referral services, especially in countries like India, where there is a resource shortage. We know that the public health infrastructure is in quite dismantled. There is lack of sufficient PPEs. There is a lot of economic hardship. So focus should be on that instead of this social, evils, what is going on. And there was a very important verdict observation that was made by Mumbai High Court on 13 June 2020, where this point was raised that the media, social media especially, should overcome its partition motive and intent and focus on what is true, what is going on, because truth can't be compromised. So, and media also has this dangerous kind of, image that if it digs too deep or too little, both can backfire. The public will always be able to identify if it if it is non-calent about what's going on, and if it digs too deep also, there is a lot of problem, because the governments expect the media to be its cheerleader. And how media has fallen short of expectation. Now, media is supposed to be the watchdog of people and not the lapdog of the government. But in various countries across the world, media is playing as the lapdog of the government. It is something which is not focusing on real issues of concern. There are bias, there are communal allegations that there are communal focus of the media on various certain sections. There is a lot of social stigma attached to it, and language is a very important problem, because language can generate xenophobia across countries. So media should be very careful the kind of language it is using to portray whatever is happening around the world. And we know that in a certain in a span of 4 hours notice, when the Prime Minister of India announced about the lockdown in March, the media was called in, and through video conferencing, he particularly said that the focus of the media should be positive and not negative on happenings and news on COVID-19. So, and the media started saying that no Prime Minister ever has folded hands and asked them to do so. So this is something which is very alarming regarding the role of media. It is most of the times there is a tendency to fall into the trap of the government. So it should avoid that. And definitely there is a lot of censorship and surveillance on the media that is going on. And we know that certain reports, certain news that comes up on social media, journalists are hounded, journalists are asked to take away those posts from the social media handles. So that is something which has happened in UP also, where a certain journalist who reported on the disenfranchisement of the Mushar community was hauled up by the district administration. Next, I'll talk about...
Dr. Basu.
Yes. I'll try to conclude. Disinformation in various countries, like whether we talk about USA, whether we talk about Turkey, whether we talk about countries like Philippines, across nations, we have seen that lot of myth busting is taking place. And there was a report by American journal of tropical medicine and hygiene, where the report said on how alcohol intake, as put up in various videos of social media, can save lives of people against COVID-19. So this is something, spread of disinformation. With also in Duterte government in Philippines, in the pretext of anti-terrorism law, has clamped down on dissent. In Google also, if we have seen reports by Think Global Health, how African countries, people know very less about what is the real thing which is going on. So all these reports come up with the fact that there is thin line of this distinction between what is real news and what is fake news. And in Turkmenistan also, there is a lot of deception and secrecy that goes on. So the role of media should be very authentic. The fight should be against inauthenticity. The onus is not only on people who are consumers and content makers now and the present times, but also on the media, social media, to resist this kind of clamping down by the government, which is very important. The media should live up to its expectations to become the conscience of nations across the world and not play to the gallery. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to keep it within the time limit. The next presenter is Ramu CM. Mr. Ramu
Yes, sir.
is going to present his research on big oil in the post-COVID-19 scenario. Okay, Mr. Ramu, please proceed.
Sure, sir. Okay. Thank you, Professor Sato. Thank you, Nice, and thank you, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, for this opportunity. Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to speak about how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the global oil and gas industry, the kind of after effects, and also about how the immediate future forecast would be. So the topic is big oil in the post-COVID-19 scenario, caught between resilience and transition. So it's kind of like a dilemma between whether you can sustain as you are or whether you need to transform yourself to actually adapt yourself for a better future. Okay, just giving a basic overview. Okay, so oil price shocks generally are driven by number one, geopolitical risk, and second, market risk. So as we have seen across the the history of oil exploration and production in the 20th century, late 20th century, from the OPEC oil shocks, and then onwards to the Iraq war, the first Gulf War, and then onwards to 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States forces. So every time, whether there is a geopolitical powder keg about to explode in some random choke point in across the world, there is always bound to be a correlation between that particular event and the oil prices. And at the same time, the other constant that is acting on this particular phenomenon is market risk, because eventually, I mean, the physical as well as financial market that is linked to oil is very much dependent on the security of demand and supply of the commodity. So currently, we have a sort of a new risk wherein the pandemic-induced risk, which is actually like destroyed demand. I mean, there has been a demand contraction, which is like which is projected to sustain for a longer period of time on top of an oversupplied market. So already there is a supply glut. There is like excess production coming from across the world from different oil provinces, and you have like very little demand to absorb this excess supply. So we have saturated storage spaces. So there is basically like no takers for cheap oil. And although the situation is improving in the third quarter of 2020, yet I mean the gloom scenario is projected to sustain for a longer time. In order to actually adapt to the changing circumstances, so big oil is basically the euphemism used for like the super major oil companies, and even the the other players, be it international oil companies, the publicly traded oil companies, the national oil companies which may be publicly traded or which may be completely state owned, and even the oil field service companies, like the ones that actually offer contractual services for drilling and exploration and whatnot. So how these companies are forced to realign their priorities to adapt themselves better to a changing market scenario. So I've actually characterized 4 different vectors which are driving these changes. So number one is like structural changes across the business chain and the supply chain. Second, it's divestment, which is like disinvesting assets and portfolios by the oil companies, and also how institutional lenders, I mean the financiers and the banks, investment banks, which have been like loaning money to these oil companies, have been trying to divest their assets, either under the pressure of shareholder returns, because shareholders are becoming increasingly skeptic, or for that matter, because governments across the world, governments and even public opinion is also, like especially in Western countries, is shifting more towards accommodating low carbon sources of energy, and energy transition will be the final impact driver. So if you look at the following histogram graphs, so you can see the like the 10 to 11 year time period in which global exploration and production, which is like the upstream sector, the major this up basically like oil, like the oil business actually like takes place across 3 different vertical segments. So you have the exploration production, which is upstream, then the midstream, which is transportation, and the retail and distribution, refining, marketing, and all comes in the downstream. So in the upstream sector, there is already, like if you see the trend, in 2020, there is a $1 trillion projected decline in the revenue that would be earned by oil companies. And as opposed to that, over the like in the investments chart, which is like over the 10 years, what you can see is that even investment commitments have also come down a lot, which is like a direct impact of what the pandemic has done to the oil industry. So if you compare both these graphs, what you could see is big oil's rising debt. So basically you see like in the previous slide, the revenue generated is quite less over the last 10 years compared to the investments, the input costs that have actually gone in terms of exploring and exploiting these oil reserves from the different provinces. So what we can actually infer from this is that oil exploration is basically financed hugely in debt and equities. So that means that there has been comparatively little returns to shareholders over the last 10 to 15 year time period. Okay, so talking about the first point, structural reformation in the oil and gas sector. So yeah, the emerging era of for big oil, I mean, which is driven by the pandemic-induced demand destruction, is going to be driven by intense competition. Yes, because it's like it's a very Darwinian way of putting it, but those companies which are already leveraged on high debt burdens are actually like filing for bankruptcies, while the super majors, the integrated oil companies which have consolidated assets and portfolios across the business chain, are able to survive and sustain. So there will be competition among those companies which can actually like go ahead with their reforms. And this will be accompanied by technology-led rapid supply response, because in order to survive in a parsimonious environment, an environment where oil prices are going to be lower for a comparatively long time, you need to reduce the break-even cost. So more innovation technology is required for that. And flat to declining demand, because even the IEA projects that demand will most probably pick up only by the last quarter of 2022 and to the first quarter of 2023. And which is going to make oil prices stabilize around the $50 to $60 barrel, which is not a pretty high amount. Investor skepticism and activism, I will speak about it in the latter slides, and increasing public and government pressure. So these companies have been using this crisis basically as an opportunity to reposition their portfolios and transform their operating models in order to have more shock absorbability, to reduce cost overruns, to accommodate more cost externalities in terms of the changing scenario. So mergers and acquisitions have been taking place, like consolidating the oil and gas assets across the business chain. So one of the significant examples which I can put forward over here is the Chevron Chevron's, like Chevron is like an American super major. Chevron's acquisition of Noble Energy. Noble Energy is a Texas-based integrated oil company. Basically, it's mostly into gas production in the Eastern Mediterranean region in the Leviathan and the Tamar gas fields of Israel. So this is like one of the most significant deals that have happened in the aftermath of the pandemic, wherein a major company has actually like acquired majority participating stakes in a company which is finding it difficult to like go about with the current environment. Then divestment of assets and portfolios. Yes, I will speak about it in the latter slides. And industry consolidation, which is basically like so safeguarding your assets to better absorb the shocks that are coming at your way. And then capacity reductions, layoffs and upgrades, financial restructuring, because there is more focus on ensuring returns to shareholders, because if you look at it, as per a survey that was conducted by global one of the famous global energy intelligence firms, Wood Mackenzie. So it has been inferred that from 2005 onwards up to the current scenario, oil companies have basically generated quite less. It has basically underperformed against the major stock market indexes, that is the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the Standard & Poor's 500 Industrial Stock Exchange Index. So it has performed poorly. Basically, it means that the stock valuation have been low. Like the amount of reserves, oil assets and reserves that have been booked have been like pretty low compared to the capital that has been invested in terms of exploiting these reserves. And also in order to bring in a reconfiguration of the value and supply chains. So if you look at the capital expenditure, which was actually pledged by some of the top-notch oil majors in 2020, and how they have actually come out with a revised version, like they have actually cut down their expenditures. You can see the blue one and you can see the yellow ones. So you look at the changes, I mean, because this is one kind of a risk that these companies did not anticipate, at least even in the last year. Because when companies plan strategies for exploration and production, they plan it on the basis of mega cycles of shifting demand and supply. So this was something that has not been anticipated. So suddenly they are coming up with revised forecasts. Secondly, so I'm going to talk about divestment by institutional lenders. So if you could see in these two schematic diagrams, so what kind of institutions are divesting? So basically these institutions that you see over here, from faith-based organizations, hedge funds, pension funds, and whatnot, and even governments. So these are not direct investors or direct shareholders in oil companies, but basically indirectly they are actually connected to oil-based or energy-based securities and stocks. So how under pressure from lack of confidence in oil company returns, or for that matter from the pressure to actually divest more into green portfolios, there have been like almost $6 trillion like a shift in divestment of these institutions in oil companies. And some of the major investment banks, how their priorities have also turned in the last the data till 2018, and how there's going to be an even major impact after 2020. Okay, so speaking on, like, as a corollary to that is the energy transition and its impact on the oil companies. So the pace of portfolio diversification into non-carbon sectors has intensified in the aftermath of the pandemic-induced investment parsimony. So already, like after the 2015 Paris Accords, there has been a lot of pressure, both by means of government pressure, policy response, and market response, and even public shaping of public opinion. There has been pressure on major oil companies, especially in Europe, as opposed to the United States, especially the European independent oil companies, to divest their portfolios and actually integrate more renewable component into their operations portfolio. So you can see from this graph about how some of the European companies, like Repsol is a Spanish major. It has actually like contributed the most. Equinor is a Norwegian company. Then Total is French. So, and Shell, BP. So mostly these are from European companies. And you can actually go through the figures. Okay. So, and this is like a comparative chart between mostly like American companies, ExxonMobil, Chevron. So, and that, in comparison with, the European companies, which have actually like divested a lot of their stakes into green and renewable component.
3 minutes, Mr. Ram.
Okay, sir. All right. So in conclusion, what to expect from the current scenario? So obviously, like I said before, there is anticipation of a lower for longer oil price environment. So you need to brace yourself for a storm which is going to last longer than anticipated, because demand is not, projected to pick up anytime soon, at least in the next year, mostly because the aviation sector is down. So a lot of the demand that is driven by the aviation sector is going to be depressed, even though some of the Asian economies like China has been, increasingly accepting gas shipments. Then you look at global refinery intake. It is slightly recovering in the third quarter of 2020, but the pace of recovery will be trailing behind the demand rebound, as product inventory levels are very high. Storage is still high. There is still an existing contango wherein the spot prices are trading at very lower levels in comparison to the forward prices. So traders are basically hoarding oil in the deep seas, in tankers and all, like storing it at deep sea so as to sell it at a higher cost when the prices rise. And OPEC plus. So if you look at Saudi Arabia and Russia, they have come up with this production cuts along with the other major members of the OPEC, but it is still insufficient because there is always this problem of uncertainty over compliance in regards to the member nations of OPEC countries, because only the top, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and for that matter, even Russia might actually adhere to the production cuts, but you don't expect that from problematic countries like Libya and Nigeria and whatnot. Then integration of renewables will actually help these oil majors with oil field operations. So mostly these oil majors are actually investing in offshore wind farms and whatnot, and they will actually like divest their portfolios and use the power generated from these renewable assets to basically like power their oil rigs and oil platforms, which are either onshore or offshore. And despite short-term demand contraction for LNG, demand for gas is projected to pick up soon, triggering competitive prices and more investments. So basically, the Asian market is going to be like specially led by Japan, then China and India, and even Korea will actually like absorb most of the gas demand in the future. And this is actually good news for the oil and gas industry, maybe like in the next 2 to 3 years to come. And finally, I like to conclude saying that the changing circumstances means companies are actually forced to speciate and mature and adapt themselves to survive in this situation. So either otherwise they have to be faced with the bare truth that if you don't adapt, then you bet if the going gets tough, the tough gets going. Otherwise, you'll just lose off and die. That's it. So that's about it. I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you. And I welcome questions. I mean, since there's paucity of time, I welcome a lot of questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Dr. Sashmita Rajwa, Assistant Professor of Maharaja Agrasen College, University of Delhi, speaking on diaspora as a factor in India-African relations in the post-pandemic world order. Dr. Rajwa, please proceed to your presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much. Let me just share my PPT. Is it visible now?
Not yet.
Okay. So a very good morning to all of you. My name is Sushmita, and I'm teaching in one of the colleges of University of Delhi. I also work with ODI, Organization of Diaspora Initiatives in New Delhi. My major research has been on Indian diaspora, so I'll be speaking on diaspora. As you've been hearing diverse and various topics today, we heard about media, oil, and now I'm talking about diaspora. So firstly, I would like to thank NICE and Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to present my views. Thank you very much. Now, my topic today, which relates to post-pandemic world order. So, between the relationship between India and Africa, how Indian diaspora has been seen within this relationship of India and Africa, and how in the post-pandemic world order, diaspora is going to play an important role in this bilateral relationship. So let's just start by giving an introduction about how migration of Indians started towards African countries. So if we look at the whole or total number of Indians who are present as diaspora in Africa, it is around 3 million people. So the migration that took place from India to Africa, mainly it started after the huge amount of migration, the large number of people that started migrating started only after the abolition of slavery. So we see that major population is found in countries like South Africa, Mauritius, Kenya, Reunion, Tanzania, Mozambique. South Africa and Mauritius are the countries where most of the Indian diaspora population belongs to the Indian indentured labor category. And East African countries like Kenya, Tanzania, other places where we see the major population is from the Indian businessmen who had migrated for business purposes. Between 1653 to early 19th century also, we find some writings that suggest migration towards these Dutch colonies that existed in Africa and British colonies too. But major migration started instantly after the abolition of slavery in 1833. Indian indentured labor system was a kind of system that was invented by the colonizers, basically to involve and to recruit the diligent and effective Indians towards African colonies to work in the plantation fields, mostly the sugarcane plantations, firstly in British colonies of South Africa and Mauritius. So this was a kind of contract which the migrants were supposed to sign, and they were initially taken for a period of 5 years, and then they were given this option to either they could come back to India or they could settle at the same country where they were living in. So this was a kind of contract that they signed, and then they took on this long journey of going towards other nations. So many Indians migrated to African colonies, many also went to the Caribbean at this time period. South Africa was the country where from we see that 1860 to 1911, around total number of 1,52,184 Indians had arrived in South Africa. So this was the time period where maximum migration took place. Another important country is Mauritius, where the first indentured labor population, the ship Atlas, arrived on 2nd November 1834. This carried the first batch of Indian indentured labor to Mauritius, and this ghat is today known as the Apravasi Bharati Ghat. And this day, 2nd November, is also celebrated as the Apravasiya Day with great pomp and show in Mauritius. So the indentured labor are much recognized in Mauritius too, where there are around 68%, they form around 68% of the population. Now, there was one other category of Indians that migrated, which was called the passenger Indian categories. So under this category of Indians, mainly traders had migrated, mostly from the east coast of India, states like Gujarat. A number of them had migrated to East African countries, Kenya, Tanzania. These places were the major countries where Indians businessmen migrated. And today, later on, they settled as very successful businessmen, entrepreneurs, and they form the majority of higher economic class in these countries today. These are just some of the images of indentured labor. As you can see, they're working in the sugarcane plantations and other plantations in South Africa and Mauritius. Now, if we talk about how the policy had taken place, how the policy was shaped from the Indian government side towards its diaspora. So from 1950s to 1990s, we see this period, we call this period of the period of disengagement with the diaspora. There was no policy of associating the diaspora. Post-independence, India was itself embroiled in many regional conflicts with its neighbors, and it was rallying the cause of non-alignment too. If we quote Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru in his foreign policy document, he had said that an Indian who goes to the other countries must cooperate with people of that country. So basically, he must win himself a position of friendship and influence. So service. The Indians should cooperate with Africans and help them as far as possible, and not claim a special position for themselves. So what he tried to reiterate here is that India is in no position to provide that help and that kind of engagement that the Indian diaspora might require from its home nation. So they should try to assimilate with the local culture. They should try and assimilate with the countries that they live in and try to position themselves as citizens of that country. But after 1990, we see a major change in the diaspora policy of the Indian government. This time period, the policy has been termed as that of active association with its diaspora. So now the policy has become the one which is actively engaging its diaspora. Diaspora became very important and useful agents for the Indian government in terms of trade, investment, technology. So in also in 2001, the recommendations of the high-level committee on Indian diaspora, which was aimed also to more broadly reimagine Indian diaspora, included people of Indian origin as well as non-Indian, non-resident Indians. So people of Indian origins was also included of other separate categories that were not earlier taken up as the ones who belong to Indian diaspora, like NRIs. In 2005, also a separate Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs was established to separate the Indian diaspora basically from the MEA, because this could be this provided a lot of hurdles in the way of implementing policies in terms of diaspora, that the MEA had to take over separate cases and separate case studies of diaspora. So a separate ministry itself was designed to facilitate the policy measures that were already taken up by the Indian government. This was a very important step if we look at. Now, the other important initiative that actually reinforced the idea of Indian government towards the Indian diaspora policy is the launching of the Pravasiya Bharati Divas. It is also an initiative which was launched on 9 January 2001. 9 January because it marks the return of Mahatma Gandhi from South Africa, who had come back on this date, and therefore they chose this date. So every year on 9 January, PBD is celebrated as a big celebration, as a big occasion where Indian diaspora from all over the world are invited to participate in the event. Earlier, there were a lot of criticism regarding the PBD. So we could find that a lot of scholars, thinkers around the idea, they criticized this policy and said that this seems and this looks a kind of policy where Indians are only invited to make investments in their homeland. So India is also only looking for their money and investment. So the kind of remittances that they are getting is the only thing that is important for the home country. However, the diaspora is looking for other things too. But now over the years, this thinking has changed because India has also facilitated PBD along with other policies to engage the diaspora, which are not related exactly or pointed specifically towards the investment side. OCI card is another important policy measure that was basically launched in 2006 overseas, providing a kind of citizenship to Indians who are people of Indian origin who are residing in other countries, which is known as overseas citizenship of India. This was a kind of recognition that was provided to Indians. Know India program was launched in 2004. This is another initiative, a very important one, aimed at the young diaspora. So we also have this category in terms of countries like Africa or Caribbean or even in the Southeast Asia. If we look at the Indian diaspora, the Indian government now understands that there is a major distinction between the young diaspora and between the old diaspora. So it has to make that distinction between them and target different groups in different manners. So
3
Know
minutes
India
now.
program is actually targeted on this youth, young diaspora. Now this young diaspora is the one that provided this opportunity to come and visit their homeland and see how their land of their ancestors is. And this is something which is actually providing them this opportunity to know their homeland. Another program is Tracing the Roots program, which was launched policy in 2008. And this program was mainly aimed at the Indians who belong to the old diaspora category. So indentured labor families are the ones who are going to be benefited with this program. They can find out which part of the country their ancestors or their forefathers had migrated from. Like most of the indentured labor diaspora that went to South Africa and Mauritius, they migrated from states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and these are the regions where they migrated from. And if they want to know exactly which place, the government is also trying to find out exactly which place they are going to they have come from, with the help of various documents and written documents that had been preserved. Because the colonizers, the British government had this policy of maintaining everything in a very organized and sequenced manner. So all the documents are still maintained. If we go to countries like Mauritius and South Africa, there are museums where they've actually preserved, archives where they've preserved the written documents. Mini PVDs, Pravasi Bharati Divas mini sections have also been started, which are hosting in special countries like South Africa. Durban was the one where 2010 mini PVD was hosted in order to basically facilitate interaction with specific countries too. So PVD is a much larger event where diaspora from different countries come together. It's not possible to provide specific issue, specific consideration on one country. So many PVDs help in doing that. Then there are other policies these are some examples, like scholarship programs for diaspora children, quiz for diaspora people of Indian origin. These actively helping engaging the diaspora in different regions. Now, if we look at how Indian diaspora is going to play a major role, Indian diaspora in Africa has it has been an active facilitator of developing this relationship between India and Africa. If we look at the past few years also, the Indian government and the Indian Prime Minister's several visits to various countries in Africa has also been a very important factor. Because the addressing and recognizing of the Indian government to these diasporic organizations is something which is very important. These Indian diasporic organizations that exist in every country, almost all the countries with major diaspora populations in Africa, they have worked effortlessly and tirelessly during this pandemic.
Dr. Rajwa, please conclude.
Yes, sir. So these diasporic organizations have worked effortlessly and tirelessly during this pandemic. They have worked in providing relief work. They have worked in providing whatever materials were needed to the local population. I think that post-pandemic, in the post-pandemic world order, the work of these diasporic organizations should also be a focus for research. So if there has to be a research on diaspora, the research should also focus on these diasporic structure, roles, functions of these diasporic organizations, and the linkage between these organizations with the high commissions. That could bring out a lot. There is also a huge population of successful entrepreneurs and industrialists in South Africa. These could also help in recovering many economies of African countries from this crisis. The Indian government can also seek several ways how to facilitate that, how to facilitate this kind of interaction between these entrepreneurs. How can they help in recovering African economies? Some of them are influential enough, because they are also part of the governments in many countries. So it can be done in a very successful manner, and this can further improve the relationship. Collaborations and cooperations in the field of medical science, because telemedicine is one of the major initiatives with the help of which India has interacted, that can be done. And tele-education, with the help of which India is already providing education, tele-education to many African universities. This can also be an initiative that can provide prospects for improving this relationship. So in all, I would like to conclude by saying that Indian diaspora can play a very major part in this world order, in further enhancing and improving the relationship between India and Africa, which already has a goodwill that as compared to any other diasporic population in the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last presenter is Ms. Utkarsha Mahajan.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
I would like to share my PPT.
Yes, please.
Sir, is it visible?
Yes, I see it now.
Yes. Yeah, my topic for today is the role of space sector in the post-pandemic world order. Here, if we see, space is one of the most relevant aspects of any international engagement when it comes to the technological domain or technology sharing amongst the nations or even the private sector. In the post-COVID-19 pandemic, it has been responsible for reshaping geopolitics at global and regional level up to some extent, but still significant. The great power competition can be seen extending beyond the traditional territorial boundaries, even as the world enters post-pandemic phase in the near future. New dimensions of the competition that need to be considered for evaluating the changes in the balance of power equations, where outer space which is the final frontier beyond the territoriality and maritime boundaries for geopolitical competition, has been one of the significant aspects in the recent times, which will continue to play a crucial role even as the COVID-19 pandemic as the influencing factor. In spite of a few delays and budget constraints during the pandemic, global space sector has been advancing. There has been hardly any impact or a slight impact on the already undergoing missions, and still new missions or new projects have been undertaken by the private and the government-run space agencies. And if we see the news, there has been at least 1 or 2 news every week when it comes to space sector or the any kind of achievements in the space sector. Space is omnipresent in the economy at the global and national level. Space technologies that are transferable to the earthbound sectors such as health, mining, education, which will be enabling the recovery from the post-COVID, from the COVID-19 losses. Especially if we see India's case, India has recently opened a private sector, which I'll come to later on. Then the pandemic has created a need for more digitized and remotely connected world, for with a need for more satellite based or telecommunication based services coming into play in the day-to-day life, or mainly the business sector, where because of the restricted mobility, where the space-based connectivity is important. Then what is the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the space sector? Leveraging the space-based capabilities, space-based services at the international level will be a major aspect of spacefaring nations' international engagement. Civilian and the strategic space technologies and the space-based assets are bound to play a vital role in the in the promotion of national interest, especially when we can observe a trend of what we say the deglobalization or rolling back of globalized world, and has been a restriction on territorial boundaries and mobility across the across the boundaries, as they operate through the various scales ranging from the small research projects and multidisciplinary initiatives. Impact of the crisis on the specific segment of the space value chains and on the individual space domains include satellite manufacturing, access to space, Earth observation, satellite communication, navigation, space exploration, and space situational awareness, which is one of the most recent aspect that needs to be considered when it comes to the navigation or the new projects come up, and for the space traffic management, and in the same domain, space surveillance and tracking, which is also an important aspect of the ground-based space services or ground-based monitoring of space. The impact of crisis can be observed on the demand, supply, public policy, and strategic impacts and actions, and also on the access to finance in order to derive a qualitative view to the on the resilience per space. If we see the space domain, one second, yeah. Next is, if we see the what have been the advances during the COVID-19 pandemic in the space sector, the space industry has continued to work even under the most difficult times, and there have been constant advances and launches have taken place even during the pandemic. Two Russian astronauts and one NASA astronaut were on board the manned mission using Soyuz rocket, which launched in April 2020 from Kazakhstan launch facility. Then Russia has also plans to test two new rockets in 2020. It is also looking forward to build its own reusable launch rocket and resume its lunar program. NASA and SpaceX successfully have launched the commercially built Crew Dragon, which has been used for a while now. During the pandemic, which was followed by a launch of Cargo Dragon in May 2020. India has been progressing in terms of its first manned mission Gaganyaan, which is set to launch in 2022. And other missions such as Aditya L1 and Shukrayaan, which are the space exploration missions for the next 5 years, which have been undertaken and which have been progressing over even during the pandemic. India's new spaceport has come up in Tamil Nadu. Earlier, India has been using its PSLV for launching commercial launches and of the small satellites. The piggybacking was one of the key features which has brought some commercial revenue in the past, and the success rate has been very high. But piggybacking has one of the disadvantages, that is the launch in the orbit has lacks the preciseness of the inclination and the elevation. So India has now come up with its SSLV design as well as the SSLV facility, which will have another advantage, that is the less time required for the assembly of the launch vehicle also, and the cost of launch is also very low as compared to PSLV. Then amidst pandemic, India opened its space sector and ISRO facility for private players, which is bound to play a crucial role in the terms of the economic engagement of the private actors in the new sector that has been open in the aerospace domain, and which has multiple multi-sectoral kind of engagement in the space domain, and vice versa also. Then China's quantum experiments at space scale, QUEST, which has tested its recent success in terms of the launch of Meteos 2 years ago, and which has established a satellite-based network using quantum entangled photon that has been sent password 1120 kilometers away, which is a major milestone in building a practical global scale and ultra secure quantum internet, through which China has claimed its quantum supremacy in the space domain. Where Google had claimed the quantum supremacy in terms of computation, China has gone for a different path for claiming its quantum supremacy, and which has a practical usage and practical implementation, which is unhackable communication, and very secured in terms of the protection of the critical infrastructure or the space-based internet connectivity. Then China has also launched an IoT satellite, which has dual-use applications, mainly in terms of strategic aspect. IoT can be used for controlling the military equipments on ground, which is another achievement. And China has also completed its Beidou constellation for the global coverage, and it has already started leveraging it to the neighborhood in Southeast Asia and in South Asia also, especially to Pakistan. They have started building their ground station alongside its industrial complexes. Then the increased role of new space is another global trend that can be observed. New space is basically, it refers to the small satellite range in the LEO, basically the micro satellites, pico satellites, and nano satellites, which are easy to launch, have specific applications for commercial purposes. It has been preferred due to the not just economy, but
You have
also
3 minutes now.
Yes, sir. So these are some of the recent trends. Then ubiquitous connectivity, 5G and beyond, which will be based on space-based internet, especially if we see the recent launches of the 60 satellites in the LEO by SpaceX, which is a part of its Starlink project. Then other this has been one of the upcoming phenomena which will revolutionize the internet connectivity and the new services that will come up. Then there are some other stakeholders which have been coming up or have been playing a crucial role in the during the pandemic. Iran has come up with its launches. One has failed in February, but it still has 5 projects ongoing for the launches in the near future. Then UAE has launched its Hope probe for the first Arab Mars mission. Then JAXA, Arianespace, Israel, South Korea, they have also been progressing in the terms of their launches and new advances in the space domain. Then components of space sector that affected that have been affected during pandemic. I'll not go into the details of all these, but here you can take an overview. If we see the domains, there are the civilian space domains that we have been looking for in terms of economic as well as for civilian applications by the government actors. Their Earth observation, satellite communication, navigation, access to space, satellite manufacturing, which has which has various aspects to it. That is ground segment and downlink services, geo satellite operators, constellation operators. Then the integration of computational techniques like big data analysis and the integration of AI with them has also been a part of recent advances that have been undertaken by most of the major spacefaring nations, but are yet to come up as a part of other spacefaring nations which are still which have their programs still at the initial level or at the level of infancy. Then space situational awareness and space surveillance and tracking has been one of the one of the domains. Then space exploration, which includes human space flights, science and astronomy, and solar system exploration. Then if we see the navigation satellites, there has been an increase in the global coverage, the navigation satellite constellations with the global coverage, and the domain has become more competitive. So definitely US is going to lose its dominance in terms of GPS and the services based on GPS, which has contributed to its economy for a long time now. Then the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the space sector. Here I'll just leave it for observation of each of the domains which have been discussed in the previous slide. So here in terms of drivers, which are the drivers, that is demand, supply, private investment and public policy. So what has been the impact of COVID-19 on that? So here if we see, there has been either a slight impact or no impact in terms of public policy, except for the Earth observation. Here we see. Then communication has been affected more negatively only in terms of private investment, and hardly any impact on the demand, supply and the public policy aspect of it. Then satellite navigation has been impacted in terms of demand, although China has been leveraging and the ground stations have been established at a faster pace in the recent times, especially in the last almost 1.5 years. Then space exploration has been slightly impacted. The progress has been taking place, although there has been a diversion of budget for the same, for the research and development in terms of COVID-19 pandemic, the technologies that have been required, like ventilators and all. Then the space situational awareness is another domain which has been affected, which has not been affected as much as the communication or the Earth observation sector. Then the access to space, which has been affected a little negatively, but still has continued to progress slowly during the pandemic. There is another source which gives a more quantified manner in which they have analyzed the impact of COVID-19 on the satellite and the space sector. Coming to the conclusion, the post-pandemic space race, which will be governed by the resilience of the space agencies, state space agencies, and the role of private players as well. There has been a larger collaboration in the private and the state government actors in the recent times, which has brought out more efficient or more better results than in the past. Space in the Sustainable Development Agenda, which has been one of the aspects when it comes to the use of the recent technologies, not use, the advances in the technologies in terms of traffic management and monitoring, space situational awareness, architectures, and the development of the infrastructure facilities for that. So the fulfillment of these sustainable development goals um, has been one of the agenda for most of the state space programs. Then space situational awareness, there is a need for integration and computational capabilities such as AI, quantum, IoT with existing capabilities. Sorry.
Ms. Mahajan, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you here. You have exceeded your time limit by 5 minutes already. So you can leave this slide on for now so that the audience can keep reading them. But meanwhile, I'd like to move on and start posing some questions to the presenters. Okay. This is only fair to the other presenters. So I'm sorry about that, but please leave the slide on for now. Thank you for your presentation. Yes. Okay. Thank you for very interesting presentations. And let me first ask questions. There is no question posted from the audience in the chat, so I have 4 questions to each presenter. And Ms. Mahajan can talk more when I ask you a question. Anyway, first to Dr. Basu, your a very interesting presentation about misinformation by social media. I'm not sure if it's limited to social media these days, especially if you watch a lot of American so-called news televisions. And the quality of news has very much deteriorated over the past decades or so, I think. But how would you see this decaying of the media quality due to the fact that the gatekeepers are way too diversified and audience have a complete freedom to choose from whatever suits the level of their intellect? Is there any solution to this problem? That is a question to Dr. Basu, and I'll ask all 4 questions first and then go back to each presenter to answer those questions. Mr. Ramu, my question, you presented a very comprehensive analysis of the state of the oil industry, the major oil companies. Very interesting description and analysis. I would like to hear more about their geopolitical relevance. What does that mean for global power competition, especially involving the United States and its key rivals like Russia and China, and some of the proxy states in the Middle East and other regions?
All right, sir, noted.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Rajawar's question, the presentation on Indian diaspora in Africa, again, it's very interesting explanation that the major foreign policy change of India, the post-Cold War period, resulted in the more active and growingly diversified interest of the Indian government in the diaspora population of Indians in Africa. My question is, currently Japan and India started talking about cooperating on Africa connectivity in conjunction with this free and open Indo-Pacific initiative. How would you see the prospect of this cooperation? What would Japan offer? What would India offer? So that's the kind of question I have. And finally, to Ms. Maharajan, my question, you presented a very broad picture of the very diverse space-related sectors and the growing competition and initiatives in this area. My question is very simple though, and quite general. When a lot of entities, governmental and commercial entities, are entering this competition, will space remain a kind of public goods, or will it be increasingly privatized? And what would be the future of governance of states, governance of space? For example, lower satellite orbits, which could be a rare commodity. Okay, so that's my question to you. Thank you. So first, Dr. Basu, you have 3 minutes to answer.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your question. As far as I can understand your question, you are talking about of decaying media quality and what is the way out of it. Because as you said that as gatekeepers of our conscience of the nation, as well as its citizens, media has become much more diversified. And the fear as well as the relief is both lay there. Now the problem is that definitely there is a way out. There are way out of problems, and here also there are way out. People has to protest against the media disinformation and misinformation. They have the right, and they should be aware. Now they are protesting. There are movements that are going on throughout the world, across nations. Protest movements. They are coming up against this, disinformation, conspiracy theories that are going on. And as has been said by Robert Entman, that the free press cannot be free. Yes, definitely the free press cannot be free, but media is building up resilience in the and this we can look forward to it in the post-pandemic world order, where the ubiquity of territorial sovereignty will going to stay, whatever may be the situation in a multipolar world. And here media can break that vicious cycle of interdependence amongst various state cartels who are doing their bit in trying to clamping down on the media. So I think this can be the way out. And one of the instances that I can cite regarding that, yes, people are answerable. Even the Facebook CEO has been answerable to people. He has been hauled up. There has been antitrust, hearing in Washington DC, and CEOs of Apple, Google, Facebook, they have met, and they are saying that media companies are no longer monopolies. They are working on that. They are working to give proper, truthful and timely information to people. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. The next, Mr. Ramu.
All right, sir. Professor Sato, you asked me about, to give a better perspective on the geopolitical power competition between the countries, the states as such. So to give a broad picture of things, so even in the post-pandemic scenario, we could see continuation of the trend that has been observed in the past half a decade or so, wherein global oil production monopoly will still be under the hands of the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. As for the US, the minor oil companies, like the oil companies that are invested in the shale patch in the Permian and the Marcellus back in shale area of the United States. So many of them have either like de-evolved, I mean, filed for insolvency and gone out of operation, but some of them have kind of like, like bundled up and sold their assets to bigger companies and bigger, utilities. So what we could see is because of a generous lending system with relatively lower interest rates and even deregulated energy sector, US oil production will, get back, we'll see an uptick in the coming years to come. And it is quite hasty to actually write off the era of the shale boom, at least even after the pandemic. And but one thing that we're not sure of is still, a lot is actually dependent on the upcoming US election. So if Trump returns to power, definitely it's going to be a deregulated energy sector, and more areas will be open for exploration, and more oil will come out of the US, thereby depressing oil prices even further. But on the other hand, if the Democrats win, it is still a little uncertain about what Joe Biden's point of view is. I mean, he might be playing the ultra left card right now in terms of election tactic, currying favor with the progressive Democrats. But for a person who is more centrist in viewpoint and who is who has more votes in the southern states, despite being a Democrat, I doubt if he will actually come up with a revolutionary new Green Deal as had been proposed. So it might not impact US oil production, oil and gas production, at least in the next half a decade or so. As regards to Russia and the Middle East proxies like Saudi Arabia, UAE and all, mostly it is the national oil companies which is supported by their sovereign wealth funds. So they have a lot of their budget surpluses, I mean cash revenue surpluses, which are actually safeguarded in the sovereign wealth fund. So they are in a better situation than more comfortable situation than the independent oil majors, which because of their exposure to shareholder expectations are forced or pressured to divest and diversify their assets. So Russia and the Middle East countries, oil is basically a source of revenue and even for legitimizing power and social stability. So this kind of competition is going to be there, but I don't expect any geopolitical events to either create a price shock in the anytime in the near immediate future, because there is going to be a supply excess for a long time to come. And on top of the supply glut, geopolitical event is not likely to create a sort of a price shock, because even demand is going to be depressed for a longer time. So geopolitics will have to take a rather back seat, at least for the next half a decade or to come. So that would be my answer to your question, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. Next, Dr. Rajwa.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your question. And you've raised a question on a very important issue which we see in today's relationship, especially in the bilateral relationship between India and Africa. This Asia-Africa Growth Corridor cooperation that had started, announced in 2017 between India and Japan, was an initiative which came out as a very important policy measure, because when we talk about, especially when we are talking about relationship between India and Africa, what we see is mainly what we keep reiterating is the historical aspect of this relationship. We have been connected historically. There has been migration. There is a huge presence of diaspora. And how can we utilize this now in today's context? India has a goodwill in African countries, that is for sure. But as in today's world order, it is not something which can be comparable to other players who are in the continent, who are already there. For example, China. If China is there in the continent, India cannot very openly compare itself with the kind of fundings and kind of the development funds that they are providing. So this is the kind of contest that we see when we discuss our relationship between India and Africa. So AAGC came in at a time when India and there were a lot of competing claims.
I think her computer froze. Can others see? I mean, can others hear her? Okay. Maybe I have to move on then. Maybe yeah, I'll ask Ms. Mahajan to answer the question which was addressed to her.
Thank you, sir. So thank you for the question. Actually, this is one of the most most debated kind of issue. That is what role commercial space sector is going to play in the global economy or global space sector. So it is means obvious that the commercial entities are going to play a major role or increased role and will have an increased share in the global GDP or the global space economy. And even the success rate has been very high when it has been a collaboration between the state space agencies and private entities in the space sector in the recent times. So the one of the issues that comes up is what kind of role the government space agencies will have to play in terms of regulating the space governance or regulating the private sector also. So there are two aspects to it. That is either it can play a role as a facilitator or as a gatekeeper. So now there has been a change in the role for the countries like US or even now India with its private sector coming up. It has been turning its role, changing its role from more as gatekeeper to as facilitators. And government will keep representing its space programs or the agenda for space on the international platforms, and there will be a distribution of responsibility among the space sector and the government sector. That's it, sir.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mahajan. Dr. Raj was back, so she can wrap up her answer.
Yes, Professor. Sorry about that. I got disconnected. I was talking about the Asia-Africa growth corridor and how it can actually, at this point of time, how it can provide collaboration between India and Japan in order to modes of cooperation with African countries. So as we see, if we see the vision document, they have talked about providing a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is one of the major security concerns in terms of India too. If we see the whole linkages from the side of the Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean. And there is also talk about improving infrastructure cooperation. Infrastructure cooperation includes digital cooperation, as well as improving cooperation in the fields of sectors like education. Education can be one major sector where the diaspora can play an important role, because there's a huge Indian diaspora that is engaged in the education sector in African countries as well. So if that kind of capacity building is provided with the help of countries like Japan, who has much better development assistance that it has been providing in Africa. In terms of ODA, it is one of the largest that is being provided by Japan in Africa. So if India gets cooperation with a country like that, it would be a great help, because it already enjoys the goodwill that it should in the continent, and it would be a great initiative that can be taken up. But still, we haven't had much of a road ahead since 2017. It was launched, and there hasn't been. I think that's it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. And now it's 4:52, so we need to wrap up this session. And thank you very much for a great presentation and very good Q&A sessions. I'd like to also thank Nepal Institute and the Water Policy Center for inviting me and take part in this very interesting panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for being with us. Saranya.
Thank you, sir. Distinguished chairs, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the end of this beautiful session, it's my great honor to propose a vote of thanks. On behalf of NICE and WPC, I would like to express our gratitude and sincere thanks to Professor Yoshiro Sato for accepting our request to chair this session. Our sincere thanks goes to all the speakers for delivering such a comprehensive and insightful presentation. We are honored to have all the speakers with us here today. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Last but not the least, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for our audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. We are truly honored to have you all with us this morning and hope to stay connected with you in future as well. I request all of you kindly join us for the next session. Thank you.